Hello again, and I suppose for the last time in this course, because this is the talk or lecture or review session, or whatever you want to call it, preparing for the final exam. So if you're listening to this lecture, um, I you should be ready to prepare for yourself to take the exam, to write the exam. And I hope you will listen to this and watch this video before you do so. Um, Obviously, you can watch this video at any point in the course. But when you get to the final exam, that means you have already submitted the first midterm and the second midterm and have received my feedback on both of those. And now you're ready for the final exam, which, as I've tried to stress and point out, in my view, is indeed a final exam. And that's really the whole point of the course is to culminate at the final. Because the point, again, for me, is what you leave this course with, which is more important than the steps along the way. So I hope you know that this final exam, which is worth 40% of your final grade, can also be worth significantly more than 40% of your final grade. It can be worth as much as 90% of your final grade if your score on the final is better than your score on one or both of the midterms. That's just the way it kind of works. I mean, each midterm is worth 25%. But if you do better on the final than you did on the midterms, percentage wise, the final will replace the midterm grades. The percentage of the finals will replace the midterm grades. So this final could be worth 90% of your grade, which is a major deal. And I think this all works to your benefit. I mean, it's not that you'll ever get less than the raw score, which is the 25%, 25%, 40%, and then 10% for discussions. That's kind of it. But this is a way to say, okay, if you did better on the final exam than you did on the midterms, this is a help for you. Go back and replace it. If you did better on the midterms than you did do on the final, they will not replace it, so you won't lose what you did on the midterms, if that makes sense. So again, if there's any questions about this, please just ask. This is a policy that I think I've talked about from the beginning. It's in the course introduction to the course document, and so by now there shouldn't be any questions about it. But if there is, please just ask. But this is it. This is the culmination of the course, and the final exam is comprehensive. Now, it still consists of two parts. Parts one and part two. Part one is, again, the identification of terms, short essay identification of terms. And that shouldn't be a problem because we've gone over that. We've talked about it in the talk for preparing for first midterm. So I'm not going to, again, go over what constitutes the expectations for the short essay terms on the terms. But I do want to go over the essay with you. There is, of course, posted the guide to writing the final exam. And so I encourage you to read that. It's just a little bit different from the guide to writing the midterms, the guide to writing the exams, just because this is a little bit different. If you look at the percentage breakdown in terms of part one and part two, whereas the midterms were 50% and 50%. Here we have 40% and 60% of the essay in part two. So I think there are 8 terms that you're being asked to answer on part one, each worth 5 points for 40 points total, or 40%, and then 60 points on the essay, or 60% of the exam is the essay. So I'm going to focus this talk on the essay. But do read the guide to writing the final exam. And as I've said before in the others, go over the list of terms to know. Because for writing, especially the part two, the essay in part two, that's going to be important. Because I think I have said before, of all the information, the textbook, the lectures, all that information, the list of terms to know is my attempt to give you a guide to say, okay, I expect you to at least know these terms and to use them as appropriate for your essays. Now, that also applies to the short IDs, which I think I've addressed before, because part of the short IDs is the context, and there those other terms come into play. So I'd say definitely as you're preparing, group the terms, those terms for the list of terms to know for the final. Group them in groups that go together, that can be categorized together or associated together. And then when you're even writing your short answer IDs, bring in as many of those as possible. Okay, and I believe I've talked about these and this approach. If I haven't, please email me and we can talk about it. Because I think it's important for you to do your very best and to share with you what I'm expecting. Okay. So I'm expecting those things. I expect you to know those terms on the list of terms to know, and to be able to use them. That's part of the exam. Uh, Now, you're not limited to that. You can bring in terms and discussions of material in the textbook or the lectures that is not represented in the list of terms to know. But that's just kind of like the bare minimum that I would expect you to know and hope you'll know for the final exam. Now, with the essay. Again, I know I've talked about the essays before, especially I think in the preparatory lecture video talk review session for preparing for exam 2 or midterm 2. I think I focused on the essay as well. But I just want to walk you through it because, again, knowing what you need to know is the key. Knowing what the question is asking and addressing all parts of the question is key here. So I'm just going to read it to you, and we can go from there. This is the essay worth 60 points. Western civilization is the myth of the West. Trace the origins, development, and impact of the myth of the West, or the ideology of the West, from the rise of civilization as such to approximately, that's C, it means Kirka, to approximately 1800, and be sure to treat 1, the emergence and development of ancient civilizations, including Greece, 2, the Augustan Revolution and the so-called fall of Rome, including the rise of Christianity, 3, the emergence and development of Christendom, and 4, the emergence and development of early modern Europe. When did civilization become uniquely and distinctively Western? What made it so? Is Western civilization then simply an idea, or how could it be defined other than as a myth? Answer these questions based on the course material, the textbook, and the lecture readings, and be sure to give specific details and examples. In other words, present as strong of an argument for your position as you can. Now, okay, how do we address this? How do we tackle this question? It starts out with asserting a thesis. Western civilization is the myth of the West. That is not necessarily a given. You can disagree with that presentation. And that gets back to the questions later on. Is Western civilization then simply an idea? And how could it be defined other than a myth? That then is questioning the thesis itself. So in some ways, you're trying to defend or refute the thesis that Western civilization is the myth of the West. In doing so, then you need to trace the development and rise of civilization in these different parts. The emergence and development of ancient civilizations, including Greece, and please read that Greece and Rome there. So if you leave out the development of Rome, this would be difficult. But then Rome is also covered in the Augustan Revolution, which is the revolution of Augustus that we talked about, and the development of the myth of Rome, going back to the first midterm, I believe it was, and the so-called fall of Rome, including the rise of Christianity. 3, the emergence and development of Christendom. And then 4, the emergence and development of early modern Europe, which was beginnings of that were dealt with and examined in the second midterm. And then here's the question, which is a major question for the course as such. When did civilization become uniquely and distinctively Western? That's a distinction I tried to make from the beginning of this course, that we need to see, okay, civilization is one thing, but when did civilization become Western civilization? We start off with the emergence of civilization in ancient Mesopotamia. How can we call that West? And one of the things I tried to problematize is the concept of the West itself, because the West is based on a point of perspective, a point of observation. There's no absolute West, and that's what I was trying to get at. And so we see that the whole emergence and development of Western civilization as being this distinction itself that was made of we are the West and are different from the East. That distinction we first see with the Greeks in the context of the Persian Wars and reading back into the myths of the Trojan War, whereby, you know, Herodotus and then Isocrates both say that, it's the first time that the Greeks achieved victory over the barbarian East. I think I pointed out there that there were Greek city-states further east than was Troy. So it's an ideological distinction. And that distinction between the West and the East became then one too that the Greeks originated as between us and the barbarians, those who were not Greek speaking, who sounded like they were saying bar, 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 bar. But that distinction between us and them, between our people or the people and the other, the barbarians, that division and how that was defined and self-defined, because that's what I'm talking about, a self-definition, kept moving geographically, quote unquote, west, because it starts kind of in Greece and then it goes to Rome and then it becomes in Europe, it becomes to include the New World. So what constitutes west and east, number one, it is based on point of observation. Number two, it also moves increasingly west as we look at the whole development. So when did civilization, what constitutes civilization, become uniquely and distinctively Western civilization? We can't just say that cities was part of Western civilization, because cities was part of civilization, the very definition of the emergence of civilization. But when did cities become distinctively and uniquely Western cities, so to speak? So that's what it's getting at. So you need to make sure that you make that distinction between civilization as such and the emergence and development of civilization. And then when does civilization become uniquely and distinctively Western? And that can be debated and argued on different bases and different perspectives. There's no right or wrong answer. I think I've tried to stress that all along, that for this course, there are good answers and bad answers. You can get things right and wrong, but there are no right and wrong answers. Today, how do we define Western? How do we define Eastern? Those are fluid terms. And so what I want you to think about and grapple with is, historically speaking, using their own self-conceptualization of we are the West, we are the West. And I pointed out, I think early on in one of the lectures, that map. I think I posted the map on the PowerPoint presentations, or in the lectures, one of the two, of the world in 1598. A map from 1598, the two hemispheres of the world. And the division was between the quote-unquote old world and quote-unquote new world, i.e. due to the Europeans, of course. So we have North and South America in the east, or the Western Hemisphere, Europe and Asia in the Eastern Hemisphere. You can take a globe and divide it any way you want. But the point here is that in 1598, the Eastern Hemisphere, Europe, was part of that. And we say that's Western civilization. Why? How? What basis? It's west of Asia, yes. But how are those designations devised? Now, we're talking about ideology. And I almost equate in this question, as it's phrased, ideology and myth. And why do we do that? I've talked about this in the lectures before, defining myth and how I use myth in terms of this course. And ideology as well. Ideology, I think I defined as the structures, the intellectual structures that allow us to make sense of our world. And in that sense, everybody is ideological. Everybody has an ideology, whether we're aware of it or not. So often the term ideology is an outgrouped term. I'm not ideological. That's those people, those radical people over there who are just ideologues. No, we all do. Question is, how are our intellectual mental structures formed? What are the influences on them that allow us to think that we see the world accurately? We talk about this whole thing of bias, and that's what I wanted to stress too. Everybody is biased, because biased just means point of observation and perspective from a given point of observation. But we have to think I'm not biased. We see things objectively. It's those people who are ideological and biased. That is a dichotomy that I argue against. And I think you would have a difficult time to claim that you or that we or some definition of we see the world quote unquote objectively, whereas everyone else sees it subjectively or biasedly or ideologically. So if you want to make that argument, it's going to be very difficult, I think, given how I have defined the term. Now, if you define the terms differently, you can say, okay, ideology has various definitions. If we view it this way, then we can say, okay, well, fine, you can do that. You can do that. I think it's still, I would discourage you from trying, so to speak, because you're going to run into problems. So often we talk about, Marxism as being an ideology. Yeah, but so is democracy is an ideology. And so it's like, okay, if you want to say, well, democracy is not an ideology, but Marxism is, or communism, or socialism, whatever you want to call it, is, there's no point in using ideology for that. You're just saying that that's wrong. I disagree with that. And go from there. Anyway, that's getting into more philosophical issues, which is not the point. The point is, how do we conceive of the development and how do we understand the development of whatever it is that is labeled Western civilization, from the origins of and emergence of civilization to the cusp of modernity. And then in 114, in the second section of this course, second part of this course, it goes on from there. So now, how do we handle this? I have those distinct periods: ancient civilization, then the Augustan Revolution, and the so-called fall of Rome. So and that's why I have Greece in that first part. But then, so you need to talk with Greece, and you need to talk about Rome. You're talking about the Augustan Revolution. Obviously, you have to talk about what is it a revolution from, and how did that develop. So that gets in the whole development of Rome. And what Augustus did, and that also includes the rise of Christianity, and then Christendom, as I emphasize in the lectures, as a concept. In the early modern Europe, when does it begin? We've seen that. We've talked about that with the Reformation, scientific revolution, absolutism, which includes also slave trade, etc. And then the emergence of human rights and the so-called Enlightenment. I say so-called because I think, as I already said, I don't like the Enlightenment. But it was a major, it's a term that is used to refer to some major developments in the West, that are valid and I think are good. I'm very much a supporter of human rights. And if we want to say that human rights were a product of the Enlightenment, then fantastic, yay for the Enlightenment. Anyway, but that's not part of the exam. My view of the Enlightenment is not part of the exam. So how do we address this? Okay. I say circa 1800. That just means sometime, up to the French Revolution, up to the Industrial Revolution, up to the time on the cusp of modernity, because the lectures go up that far. Textbook ends in circa 1715, right, with the end of Louis XIV. Fine, great. Louis XIV dies in 1714. It's a convenient stopping place. There's no absolute periodization. That's another issue this sort of gets at. So it's a long sweep of chronological development. If you think about it, it's a lot more material, a lot more development, a lot more chronological coverage in this first part of Western Civ than in the second part. And just as a footnote, I will be teaching H114 Western Civ 2 in the spring, if anybody's interested. Different textbook. It will cover the development. There'll be certainly some overlap. If you've had this course, there'll be some fair amount of overlap. Kind of like this course ends here, and 114 next semester will go like this. So I'm not saying that you have to take it with me by any means. You may not have to take 114 at all, but if you're interested, um, at least you have a very good foundation and base for pursuing and continuing with my 114 course in the spring. That's for later, but just as a note. So that is what this question is getting at. And then it's like, okay, this whole concept of the West based on this development that we've seen from the origins of civilization to the cusp of modernity, what makes it Western? Isn't it simply an idea, an ideology, a perspective, a point of observation? And then, if that is the case, what distinguishes that from myth? Because I have used the terms, a myth is a story that expresses an experienced reality, even if not literally. Is there a reality to the myth of the West? And I would say absolutely. Look at, in some ways what's going on in the world today. Tensions between East and West. We have this concept of Western tradition, the Western civilization. And that can lead to political, military conflict. Is it then based on anything? Well, there's based on some things, definitely. But still, that concept is not there. If we could almost call it, instead of Western and Eastern, we could call it, the red team and the blue team. And the red team is the West, and the blue team is the East. And we could use those terms to describe the same phenomenon, if that makes any sense. So, what difference does it make that the West is a myth? The myth of Western civilizations, as I both at times have phrased a similar type of question, is defend or refute the question, the thesis that the myth of Western civilization is Western civilization. The foundational myth is this whole concept of we are different. And there are elements that distinguish and differentiate in broad terms Western thought from Eastern thought. Here, how we define Eastern? Well, that's difficult, isn't it? So it gets to be a real problem. And the reason I ask these types of questions is not because there's an answer, but to problematize the concepts we use to describe ourselves. That is, I think, important. It's not necessarily going to change the conflicts that exist still today, but it can help our understanding of them and how we go about addressing them, so that we're not dealing with concepts that have no basis in actuality. So let's deal with the actualities in some ways. Now, this goes back to issues I've talked about in lectures too, in terms of belief, ideas. What's the most important factor in historical development? Is it not belief? And then how are those beliefs formed and shaped, and why do we believe what we do? That's what this question is getting at with respect to Western civilization. Now, you can argue anything you want. Well, let me put a caveat to that. You can argue any position that you can defend based on the course material. Because again, this is not a question that's asking for your opinion. It's not asking, what do you think about the West? What do you think about the thesis of the Western civilization being a myth? That's not what the question is about. It's not about your opinion. It's about your analysis and use of the course material. How well can you formulate an argument based on the course material as the evidence to support your position? Because that is what we have, we in this course, that's what we have in common, the course material, the textbook and the lectures. You can disagree with them, but then you have to go outside the course material and say that's not part of the course. So based on the evidence, and you can refute if you want to say that the textbook is wrong. I've said that in my lectures at times. I hope you know that if you know there's a discrepancy between the textbook presentation and the presentation of the lectures, you should follow the lectures, except for dates maybe. But but in terms of overall positions or interpretations, follow the lectures because that's coming from me. That's my contribution to this course. Doesn't mean you have to agree with them, but if you disagree, then you have a case to make, and you really have to prove it. And you can't prove it by citing Wikipedia or the internet or something else. So it would be difficult. And if you want to do that, I'd say the best thing to do is email me and let's talk about it. I can help you with that. All right. But in general, the basis for grading your essay, your final exam, is the course material. How well do you analyze, deal with the course material, and apply it to the question given you? And that is the basis of all the course material. What do you bring as evidence to present your case to the judge, which in this case is me? Yeah, rightly or wrongly, for better or for worse, it is. And you have to persuade me that you're right, that you've done a good job with analyzing the evidence, the course material, and that your case is the strongest case as possible. Now, I hope that helps work through this question. Make sure you address all parts of the question. Make sure you bring in as much evidence as possible. Be sure that you find ways to bring in as many of the terms on the list of terms to know as are functionally pertinent to your argument that can strengthen it, broaden it out, and keep in mind more is always better. In terms of this course, for me, more is always better. How do you go about showing me what you've learned in this course? That, in some ways, is what the final is about. I could have just said, okay, what do you think about Western civilization? I thought, okay, I've never really had the guts to do that. I've also thought, for the final, we should just say, Western civilization. So what? But I never had the courage to do that because I think people would not really get it, etc. So I try to be more precise and give more structure to the question. That's what I try to do here. But kind of behind that is simply, what do you do? What do you make out of it? How do you put it all together yourselves? You've read the lectures. What do you think about them? How do you put it together? If you say, oh, I don't believe that, why? On what basis? On what basis? What is the evidence for your position? It can't be your belief or your opinion unless you have evidence to back it up. Everybody's entitled to their opinions and beliefs. But when you're making a case in court, which I've, again, made the analogy between historical argument and legal argument, when you're making a case in court, you have to present evidence to back up your positions. And that's a distinction I've tried to make between argument and arguing. Arguing is simply going, you're wrong, I'm right, you're wrong, I'm right. That gets us nowhere. What is the evidence? And we should be able to agree on the evidence and what the evidence says. Namely, what does the textbook say? What do the lectures say and argue? How do those fit together? And we can disagree about how to interpret those things. But those things are the basis of the course material. Does it make sense at all? I hope it does, because and I intend this to be a help as you're preparing for your final. But it's also broader because, again, looking at the political discourse in our country and in the world in many ways, so often it's based on arguing and not argument. What is the basis for differing positions? And there's always going to be difference of opinions, and there's always going to be differing interpretations. But it has to be based on the evidence. Otherwise, there's no point of arguing. We can't argue. We can't formulate arguments about what is the best ice cream in the world, chocolate or vanilla. I know I'm right. It's vanilla bean, actually. That's the best ice cream. Haagen-Dazs, vanilla bean. And no one can prove to me that I'm wrong because I know it's the case. And so, if you don't agree, you're wrong. It's an issue of taste, opinion, belief. There's no basis to argue that, except I like it the best. But if we had a bowl of some kind of frozen looking material, I could say, this is vanilla bean ice cream, and you could say, this is chocolate ice cream. That could be determined because it's based on that stuff that's in the bowl. We could analyze it and say, oh, yeah, you're right, it is chocolate. Like, I'll, taste it. Yeah, that's chocolate. Okay, I was wrong. But we could analyze it. Maybe is it even ice cream? Maybe it's, frozen yogurt or something. We could analyze that physical material to claim what it was. But whether I like it, my own personal taste, whether chocolate is better than vanilla, is a personal taste. Personal taste is important, but it's not based on evidence. That's what we need to get back to in the country and the world, is recognizing the legitimacy of various tastes and opinions without letting those tastes and opinions affect the material basis of the evidence for an argument. Anyway, that's going beyond the terms of the final, but that's just putting what I'm trying to do in this course and with the final in a broader context, because historical argument is based on the evidence. Otherwise, we're just yelling back and forth about opinions, and it doesn't really matter unless it's based on the evidence. And the historical evidence exists. It does. And it questions us. How do we understand this? What does this mean to us? What did it mean to them at the time? How is this still present and here? And that's what we're really looking at in terms of historians. That's what we do as historians. We look at the documents, the extant evidence. Your textbook itself is not evidence of the past. It's evidence of one presentation based on the evidence. My lectures are the same way. I talk about some of the evidence. The textbook talks about some of the evidence, the sources, the source material that exists. That's the evidence. And so, for in terms of this course, it's kind of the evidence is one step removed, meaning we're not really basing this course on the documents themselves as such. Anytime you can refer to a document, you should. I mean, the textbook gives little excerpts. I've discussed a number of documents and sources in the lectures. That is all the foundation of historical argument. But you're getting it as presented in my lectures and as presented in the textbook. But for the course, the textbook and the lectures are your evidence. And those are things that exist that we can argue about. So if you just say, well, Sack is wrong, blah, 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 blah. It's like, why? On what basis do you say that? Same way, if you say Sack is right, and this is exactly the way it was, why? On what basis do you say that? Now, there's evidence. There's the answer that you have to, or the case that you have to, for which you have to provide an answer, an argument to convince me that you have sufficiently understood, analyzed, processed the course material to be able to present your own argument in the case that can convince me as judge that your argument is worthy of a top grade or some grade. That's the task before you. Again, I hope that makes sense. I don't mean to belabor points, but since this is my last chance to talk to you, so to speak, at least as a group, I think I've covered about everything I can cover. I hope this hasn't confused you more or put more pressure on you. That's certainly not the case. This talk was designed to help you approach the final, help you prepare for it, and then just finally, before I wrap up completely, keep the practical details in mind. Number one, there are no late submissions for the final, period. It's due December 15th by 11:59 p.m. Um, and that won't be extended. If there's an emergency, it has to be a real emergency. It's not my computer died or my dog ate my term paper, which is, I'm not sure if you're aware of that excuse. That's before all of the digitalized, computerized submissions of things that used to be the stereotypical joke excuse of, why didn't you turn in your term paper? Well, my dog ate it. It was all done, but my dog ate it. My computer lost it, or I turned in the wrong one. That won't work. Okay, I maybe have given leeway on midterms, but for the final, if you submit the wrong version, tough. Okay, so be sure to know what you're submitting, and when you hit that submit button, that will be the basis of your grade. So therefore, give yourself some time, if at all possible, to proofread beforehand. Once you are finished writing it, give your little self time, take a breath, and then go back and proofread it and say, is this presenting myself? Because that's what you're doing. Your argument, you're presenting yourself in the way that I want to. Is it accurate? Does it actually represent what I've learned and what I've analyzed and what I can do? Grammatically, again, I don't grade on grammar, but if your final exam is riddled with grammatical mistakes, that says one thing to me: I don't care. This is your final grade. You should care about it. So take the time to do a good job and a careful job. Okay. Again, I'm open to reading drafts, complete drafts or partial drafts. Again, the caveat is that if everybody sends me a draft on December 14th, I'm not going to be able to get to them. And that wouldn't be fair of me to only get to some of them. So it's first come, first serve. The earlier, the better. And I would say get me a draft by December 10th or 12th. As I've also said, usually students don't do that. They rarely send me drafts. I understand that because of time constraints and understandings. I've had more students claim that they would like to and will plan to and will do so, and then they don't get to, and I understand that. That's not a problem. So just practically, I probably will have time if one of you or two of you or whatever, send me a draft to get to it. But if everybody does, or a lot of people do, right before the due date, I won't be able to get to them. So the sooner the better. First come, first serve. We go from there. Okay. If you have questions, email me with questions. That is certainly encouraged, because again, this is your last shot in this course. That being said, I think that about covers it. Reread the guide. Obviously, you can listen to this talk repeatedly. Make sure your ducks are in order, so to speak, if you know that phrase. And good luck and give it your best shot. And I'm really looking forward to reading all your essays. And if any of you are planning on taking 114 in the spring, we'll have a lot of fun in the spring as well. It'll be a little bit different than this course in some ways, not only content-wise, but also structurally wise, but we'll talk about that too when we get there. Okay. Good luck. I've enjoyed meeting you as I have. I still wish this had been all in person, but I'm trying to make the best of the situation that we can make of it. And so I hope this has been a good experience for you. I guess I should say, I'm supposed to say, even though I really don't. Student evaluations, you'll be receiving an email about student evaluations. I'm not going to spend more of your time talking about student evaluations too much, but the department and school would appreciate you taking the time to fill out the student evaluations and submit them. I would just say please do so honestly. Um, and, hyperbolic praise or hyperbolic condemnation are not helpful. But thoughtful, reflective comments are. What did you find most useful in this course? What did you like most about it? How could it be better? Those types of things. Those are taken into consideration. I do read the student evaluations, and I do take them seriously. Um, but enough said. There's no requirement that you do it whatsoever. But it can be a help. Anyway, that being said, I hope you've gotten something out of this course. And I hope it's something that you'll take with you and at some point in the future, after you're long gone from H113 in Western Civ, that you'll have some experience of, oh my gosh, that was really neat. I learned, I remember something about that from Western Civ. Uh, General education courses work that way. All of a sudden, something will pop up that you're not really expecting. You think, oh yeah, I have a frame of reference for that. That was my Western Civ course. I know what they're talking about. That's the value of it. It changes how we view things. I hope it will have done that for you. And again, good luck. And I will be looking forward to reading your exams. If there's any questions, just reach out. You know where to find me. Okay, take care. Good luck. Thank you very much. And I'll see you next year or sometime. Bye bye.